guys. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. You know we love to have our favorite authors here at Watermark, and one of the reasons we're able to do that so much, to bring great authors to you guys, is because you guys keep turning out. So keep it on, and we love to have you here. We've got some other great events coming up soon. Coming up on July 9th, we're welcoming back to Wichita Hampton Sides, and he writes these great histories. They read like thrillers almost. This one is Captain Cook and his final voyage, so that should be a fun event on July 9th, and that will be also at Watermark at 6 o'clock. And then we're thrilled to welcome to Watermark Marjan Kamali, and we'll be hosting her here at the store on July 16th, and that's a Tuesday as well at 6 o'clock. A new novel, The Lion Women of Tehran. It's excellent. She's going to be in conversation with one of our booksellers, Shane Grable, so that should be a fun event coming up as well. And if anybody is a sci-fi fantasy fan, we are hosting Lev Grossman. He's kind of a big deal in the sci-fi world. He wrote this series, The Magicians, which was turned into a TV series, but he has a brand new book coming out called The Bright Sword, and it's kind of a reimagining of Arthurian legend. So that'll be a fun event coming up on Monday, July 22nd at 6 o'clock. So our July is looking packed. But looking ahead, I wanted to give you guys a heads up about Bookstore Romance Day. It's kind of a fun new bookstore holiday that we've been celebrating for the last couple of years. And we're actually turning it into Bookstore Romance Weekend. So Bookstore Romance Day is Saturday, August 17th, and we are hosting Lila Sage, who writes these steamy cowboy romances on Sunday. So she'll be here on Sunday, August 18th at 2 o'clock. So that'll be a fun weekend here at the store. But we're here today to welcome Tim Schaffert, one of our favorite authors here at Watermark. This is his 7th novel, The Titanic Survivors Book Club, and we have been reading and loving him the whole time. I was just reminding him that I met him for the first time for one of his books, The Devil in the Sugar Shop, up in Omaha for my first MEBA spring meeting for the Midwest Booksellers Association. Jason, you were there. He's currently the chair of the English department at University of Lincoln. And also a really cool, interesting thing I just learned, he's the editor for Zero Street Fiction, which is a publisher committed to LGBTQ+ literary fiction. And so we're thrilled to bring him today to tell us about his new book. This is one of my favorite reads of the summer. It's got everything. We've got a Paris in the 20s, we've got a Japanese candy heiress, antiquarian bookseller, a bohemian artist, all kinds of great things. And please help me welcome Tim Schaffert.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Do I need to, is this picking that up? I never know how this machinery works. All right, there we go. I'm going to take a picture. This is just like, because I didn't expect very many people. So which is why I also don't have enough swag. But if you need some, and you don't get some, just give me your address and I'll send it to you. So I live in Omaha. I drove down today. Love this bookstore. Love booksellers. I owe my career to booksellers, frankly. Like, I'm not the most famous writer in the world, but somehow they keep publishing me because booksellers keep putting my books in their stores. And so it's always great to connect with independent booksellers and like the Midwest Independent Booksellers Association meetings and such. It's always so thrilling to be able to connect in that way with the people who are actually connecting with the readers directly. So I thought I would read a little bit, and then if you have some questions, we can just have some conversation. But I'll start at the very beginning, and I'm going to bounce around just a little bit, but I don't want to read too long, so keep track of my time. So this is from the very beginning. It's 1913. I spotted my name again and again on the lists of the dead. Even as the weeks went by and the reports got fixed, my name didn't budge. Lists of those who perished and of those who didn't began to be published only days after the wreck. And for days after that, as facts shifted, a name might slip from one list to the other. People who lived died, people who died lived. But my death stuck to me. I didn't write anybody about it. I didn't ask for any correction. I only waited. In dark moments, I wondered, what if they're right? It became a nightly habit at a corner pub. I'd take my gin with a blast of siphon seltzer, the liveliest cocktail I could think of, and I'd eyeball the evening edition to take my pulse. Speaking of gin, I arrived at the hotel, and I had not eaten all day, and they're like, oh, do you want a shot of our signature cocktail in our speakeasy? I'm like, sure. And I guess I wasn't thinking that it was like alcohol. I don't know why. I shot it back, she's like, it's a gin-based drink. I'm like, oh yes it is. If I stumble, I apologize. Not that I would have refused it had I not, noticed. But then one night, a few weeks in, my name was nowhere. It was also very good. It was like had some kind of fruit flavor or something. I was not able to diagnose exactly. Then one night, a few weeks in, my name was nowhere. I kept checking the reports for days after to see if I'd someday show up on the lists of survivors, but I never did. I simply ceased to be. Nonetheless, I know, for as long as my name lingered in the newspapers around the world, people noticed me. Though I'm unknown far and wide, my name is as famous as it is uncommon, and I know exactly what they thought when they saw it. They maybe even muttered it, tried it out on their tongues, performed it. Alas, poor Yorick. My dad fancied himself a Shakespearean actor, though he was merely a vaudevillian in the middle of America when he named me. My father cared only for his characters. But Yorick wasn't even that. It was only a prop, a skull for Hamlet to hold. Alas, poor Yorick, Hamlet says in the Boneyard, gazing into the empty eye sockets of a dead clown. You'll live forever on the stage, my father told me once when I was a little boy, when I complained about the name he gave me. You'll donate your skeleton to the theater. Every time they do Hamlet forever after, they'll hold your head up high in the limelight. Over a year after I was pronounced dead, I received an invitation to the Titanic survivor, it said, with only a time and a place and nothing else. The invitation arrived as a message in a bottle, and the message had been folded into a little paper boat, like those boats that boys and girls fold from newspaper and send drifting in a fountain. I could tell from the odd nature of the night that this was nothing at all official. I wasn't being summoned to an insurance office or called to testify. I propped up at the bookshop's front door with a fat medical atlas on human anatomy, and there the bottle was, sitting upright in the doorway. I heard it before I saw it, a breeze whistling across the bottle's lid. My shop was full of novels that started this way, stories of unrequited love, lies, revenge, mistaken identity, secrets, and confessions, and regrets, revealed in letters sent, intercepted, purloined, lost, burnt. Or maybe I was already reading into that message before I could see a word of it. I wanted to be rescued by that paper boat. I bought my shop in a whim, practically, with an inheritance I would have been better off putting in a bank. And in the months I'd owned the shop, I'd managed to add far more books to its shelves than I'd sold. Whenever it was quiet, which was most of the time, I swore I could hear the weevils working their jaws, devouring the books from the inside out, eating my every word. After retrieving the bottle, I went to the back of my shop to my workbench built from the shell of an old upright piano. Beneath the lid, where the hammers and pins had been, I kept my tools and supplies and installed a narrow tabletop over the keys of chipped ivory. I sat on the piano bench and back to the shop. I went fishing for the message through the bottle's neck with an awl I used for repairing broken spines, but I gave it up quick when I wrapped the bottle in a square of flopped foot cloth and struck it with a mallet. When I opened the deep blue velvet, the midnight sea lay before me, the boat tossed across the glistening waves of shattered glass. I tugged at the boat's sails to unfurl the minnow. Either someone had made a mistake in inviting me, or they peeked inside my soul, because I had survived the Titanic, despite having had both feet on dry land when the ship sank. And that survival had changed the entire direction of my life. By not boarding the ship as planned, I put a twist in my own plot. You yourself are a Titanic survivor, you might say, because you didn't board either. You'll say that we're all survivors of tragedy if you look at it the way that I look at it. And there is a truth to that, I suppose. When you hear of a neighbor who stumbled on the stairs to her demise, your own staircase was suspicion. Every step up was a death averted. The train goes off its rails, a girl gets poisoned by a bad oyster, a thug cuts a man's throat in a dark alley. In every instance, it is you. You live another day. Your daily paper is full of reports of your own survival. I think I'll skip ahead a few pages to the meaning that you used while receiving this invitation. At the hotel, a waiter handed me a little globed glass of cognac and led me to the billiards room at the back. I'd arrived early, but everyone else had arrived even earlier. Though they all looked up when I stepped in, they just as quickly looked back down. No one met anyone's eyes, no one spoke, no one whispered. Everyone seated around the long mahogany table. They fussed with the buttons on their cuffs or twisted the rings on their fingers. There were 11 of us once I took my seat. I'd expected all women and children first and all that, but there were nearly as many men among us, and I'd expected those women to be rich. The story of the Titanic has many morals, and chief among them is survival of the fittest. The fittest, in this instance, being the passengers of first class. We certainly didn't need the Titanic to teach us that. I swore I could hear somebody's furtive glances dropping into the cognac. Plink, plunk. But no, an old lady was plopping sugar cubes into her drink. She then stirred those cubes around and around and around with the tongs. We were all of us grateful for the god-awful racket, for the clinking of the silver against glass, because it gave us something else to worry about. Won't her stirring ever end? I could feel our hearts uniting over our hatred of this woman and her noise. The billiards hall had been a chapel, and our benches were unforgiving pews whittled by monks. We shifted and sighed and plucked splinters from our silk and tweed. When church and state separated in 1905, loi de séparation des Églises de l'État, less than a decade ago, France sold off ownership of this monastery, one of the oldest in Paris, to a hotelier snatching up sacred properties. The hotelier kept the pews, the tapestries, the stained glass windows, and even the cold drafts that moaned along the walls like hymns of complaint, making the place a quaint relic for tourists. The hotel kept everything but the monks, who'd been swiftly evicted. I bought a little baby pram to this very chapel to collect their hymn books of feather-light paper and their prayer books with leather covers so soft you could sleep on one beneath your head, all of them bought for pocket change. I'd since been hollowing them out at my workbench to sell as pretty little jewel boxes for your rings and cufflinks, for secret vaults to hide your valuables on a shelf. So many of the books in my shop were worth more when they cut out their insides. When we weren't all avoiding each other's eyes, we were staring at the table's centerpiece, a toy model of a ship, most likely the Titanic itself. I counted the lifeboats, and I counted them again. Finally, the man next to the woman with the sugar cubes, a bald-headed Brit, put his hand on her wrist, stopping the stirring, but the sudden return of the silence made us miss the clink-clank of the tongs. The man took it upon himself to be the first to speak. I feel we're waiting for a detective, he said. We've been gathered, like in the last chapters of the Mrs. Murder mysteries. He tilted his head with a little tick, a little jerk from the woman, Mrs. herself, I presume, Mrs. Sugar Cubes. Who said anything about murder? Came a voice, high-pitched, from a man at the end of the table. I did, of course, said Mr. Sugar Cubes. You just heard me. Nobody said anything about murder, he said. I won't sit here and listen to talk of that. But sit, he did. I wondered if I would lie after all. We went around the table to introduce ourselves, but I admit that I've been nowhere near that iceberg. Any group of Titanic survivors had every right to be disgusted by the likes of me. The ship had barely had a chance to reach the ocean floor before the frauds came rushing out like rats. Anyone could veil themselves in widow's weeds to collect charity. I couldn't bear to deceive them. I couldn't bear to offend them either. I could never know the fear they knew, not just as the ship went down, but as they drifted in their lifeboats waiting to be lost. Nothingness is everywhere. Once you've seen a night so dark, you will ever see daylight again. Did everyone's invitation arrive in a bottle? A woman asked. She wore a hat of black velvet with a brim that drooped. Her red dress shimmered and shadowed in the light of the lamp. This gave the embroidered blackbirds up and down the silk the illusion of taking flight and thrashing, as if a hunter's rifle had just popped off. She held forth in a hand gloved in black lace a piece of paper. Or was my invitation peculiarly theatrical? She made much of those words, peculiarly theatrical. The C's clicking in her throat, the L's and the R's rolling over each other slow. I recognized her, the great Delphine Blanchet, the tragedian of the Paris stage, famous for dying 100 deaths. Over the decades, she had expired on stage from tuberculosis, scarlet fever, cholera, smallpox, arsenic, strychnine, antimony, despair, longing, grief. She was known in France as La Pleurnicharde, the crybaby. Was it Delphine, though? I'd read those lists of the dead or alive backward and forward, studying them to see if I was still lost at sea. I would have noticed Delphine surviving. I wouldn't have had to look too hard. In Paris, she would have had day after day of front pages. Vive la Pleurnicharde! Everyone brought out their invitations. One man had even brought the bottle, somehow unbroken, the note somehow still inside, the boat somehow unformed. The squeaky-voiced man spoke up again. Which one of you is responsible for this, and what do you want from us? Mr. Sugarcube spoke next, a jovial fellow, really oblivious to the tensions. The Mrs.'s murder mysteries have invitations in them sometimes, don't they, love? He said. And letters and such. Did you ever write a mystery with a message in a bottle? So he hadn't been referring to the murder mysteries the Mrs. simply read, he meant the ones she wrote. I realized that this is the woman I wrote about. She penned crime novels under the nom de plume of Penelope Quinn. She booked at the Titanic to travel to New York to meet with her publisher. But the publisher, pinching pennies, saved her life by insisting she arranged for cheaper passage. Her anecdote had been in all the papers. A woman who peddled in stories of death skirts a death of her own. I'd wondered if it was even true, if it was a publicity stunt. Either way, cheating fate was good for sales. I hadn't sold any of her books myself, but the shop at the end of my block had seen an uptick, and the bookshop around the corner too. And there you see part of my core business sense. I bought a bookshop in a neighborhood full of bookshops. And just a little beyond those shops is the long stretch of bookstalls along the quay of the River Seine. Penelope Quinn then spoke, but she seemed to have not been listening much. You can break into a sealed envelope without anyone knowing, she said. She slurred a little, and her cheeks were so rosy they were nearly blood red. I suspected she'd had more than just the one glass of cognac in her sugar cubes. Or you used to be able to, with some of the older waxes. Hold the seal over a flame, and then you can pry it off intact to glue back later, after you read the letter, tucked it back into the envelope. Yes, it's quite simple. The wax is the right kind. After you heat up the seal over a candle, you can pry it off with a cat's whisker. Cat's whisker, people murmured, perhaps to be polite. I suspected they were all just desperate to mutter about something inconsequential. Then came a woman's voice, satin smooth but tinged with a sting of sarcasm. Do you remove the cat from the whisker first? She said. Zinnia, that went out later. Zinnia was a tall Japanese woman with an American accent. Making her seem even taller was her hair, all gathered up and twisted around and stuck through with 3 long-toothed combs of ivory. I squinted at her to study the combs and realized they'd been whittled into the shape of sailboats, ivory boats in a sea of hair that was a luminous black, like it had been washed in squid's ink. This was before the war started nipping at the long skirts of ladies, before fabric rations and practicality and defiance of the hemlines up from the ankle and along the calf and possible out below the knee. Zinnia's dress was going in the opposite direction, longer than most, covering her shoes at the train like a bride's, swirling at her feet. She wore ermine over her shoulders, and though it was a scarf of snowy fur, it somehow looked as summery as that hot August day. Everyone at the table looked to the mystery writer for an answer. Penelope Quinn just looked back at us, quizzical, till she finally replied in all seriousness, well, I suspect the task would be much easier if the cat was off the whisker, wouldn't you say? I would say, Zinnia said, and then she looked right at me. She seemed to wink at me and smile as she took a sip of her cognac. I turned my head to see if she meant the wink for someone behind me. Though there wasn't anyone there, I did just then notice a 12-person box. A sofa faced an enormous fireplace on the other side of the room, gray stone blackened with centuries-old soot, and draped over the back of the sofa was a hand, and over the arm of the sofa a foot. The fingers wiggled, the foot tapped at the air. The man then sat up from his lie down to reach over to that foot, to tighten the lace of his boot, His long dark hair reached to his collar and fell across his face. He stood from the sofa, coming into my vision, piece by piece. He was a shrug of the shoulder, a lift of the chin, the tuck of his hair behind his ear. He was a yawn, and a stretch, and a flutter of long, ladylike eyelashes. Haze, he would tell us later, in a voice much deeper than his pretty face would suggest. So those are sort of the three main characters that we follow throughout the book. Yorick, the narrator, Zinnia, and Haze. I'm just going to jump ahead for a little bit. Zinnia becomes kind of invested in Yorick and his life as shop, and she's the heiress to a candy place. And so she lives in Paris, and she's able then to her mother's Japanese, and so she draws from the Japanese traditions, and her father's an American and draws from those candy traditions. And so she's helping Yorick gain a sense of professionalism and to turn his bookshop into something that might be profitable. So she's using her own business sense in that regard. And so she's taking him out for the day to get him a haircut, buying a suit, and meanwhile she's promising that just attending to the shop. And so they've gone out and they're returning. After we turned the corner, my shop getting closer, Zinnia stopped me. I could see the windows, but the mermaids were still faint, the glass catching the reflection of the early evening sunlight. She unknotted my necktie, removed it. "You're undressing me right here," I said. She covered my eyes with the necktie, wrapped the ends around the back of my head, and tied a knot into the silk. She then led me blindfolded down the middle of the street. "Why are we doing this?" I asked. When we reached the tables of Cafe Cappuccino, which is just across the street from the bookshop, she pulled out a chair for me. I reached down to feel the seat beneath me before sitting. "I want you to see the windows all at once," she said. "And you're going to have a few sips of something so that you're in good spirits." "You're starting to worry me," I said. "Don't be worried." Zinnia had this entangled for me. When we sat down, she kept her arm in mine. She rested her cheek on my shoulder. "Zinnia," I said, "what had you so upset yesterday? Can you tell me?" "I already told you." She said. "No," I said, "you did." I began to lift my blindfold so I could see her, but she reached up to tuck the blindfold back into place. I put my hand to her hand, held it at my cheek, kissed her palm. "Don't worry," she said. Once again, I pushed up at my blindfold, and again she tugged it back down. She kissed my cheek. I heard the waiter come up to the table, and the sound of the glasses on the tabletop, but we hadn't ordered anything. "Drink," Zinnia said, and I felt the glass at my lips. "I know you've come to have a taste for Haze's gin." Haze's gin. Now that was poison. It raised the hairs on the back of your neck, sent a chill up your spine, and worked like a love potion, making you susceptible after only a few sips. "To be honest," Zinnia said, "I blindfolded you so I could just sit here and stare at you and admire your haircut without you noticing." She fed me more gin. "I'm taking my blindfold off," I said. "I won't stop you," she said. So I did, and I blinked at the sun from my eyes and looked toward the shop. One window was in French, the other in English, and both had the same mermaid at the center, the Serin of my shop's name, a mermaid of my very own. She brought to my mind all the mermaids of my seafaring days, the ones etched into the wood signs of seaside taverns and painted on the sides of ships and tattooed on the arms of sailors. The tips of her tail fin were pointed upward, giving her the shape of a hook at the end of a fishing line. In one hand, she held an open book at her chest, hiding her naked breasts. She looked straight ahead with wide, cartoon eyes, casting her soul. "Say something, Yorick," Zinnia said. "It's like that mermaid was always there," I said. "I already can't remember what it looked like before. Does that mean you like it?" I don't know what to say." "Oh, Yorick, please don't be at a loss for words, not now." It was like a mirage lost sailors would see on the horizon, the Fata Morgana, a sign of life where it was unlikely, a vast island with the full sails of a rescue ship, mermaids frolicking. "Imagine," I said, and stopped. I was on the verge of tears myself. "Imagine your own bookshop, In a city like Paris, imagine it just appearing before you. Suddenly, the windows seemed more fragile than they ever had. Not once I worried about them breaking, but now all of Paris seemed full of flung bricks and clumsy birds. The artist used pearly for the letters, which he outlined in thin lines of silver foil. At the top of the window is written La Librairie Sarin, and at the bottom is my name, comma, propriétaire. And beneath that, Intendant de la Bibliothèque du Titan. I looked over to the English translation of the window to make sure I was seeing it straight, and there was, library steward of the Titanic. I walked into the bookshop so I could see how the mermaids looked backward and see what kind of shadows they cast. Once inside, I saw there had been more than just a window engraver at work. There were a few new wing chairs of burgundy leather and new lamps with stained glass shades of dragonflies and irises. But most astounding was the space overhead, hanging from the ceiling where it must have been 25 toy ships, maybe 50, of various makes and shapes. They appeared to be hovering, floating far overhead. The stream was too fine to see. Only minutes later, men walked through my open door with cases of champagne already chilled, and waitresses with trays of glasses, and yet other men with cakes and pastries, all in the same pastel colors of the candy almonds served at baptisms and first communions. There was some shades of pale rose, of blue clouds, with the silvery green of lamb's ear leaves. We're christening the shop, Zinnia said, suddenly at my side, with a little party. It had all come together behind my back. I couldn't take my eyes off my windows, and looking out of them seemed to transform the city itself. The city outside my windows was suddenly a place I was welcome. I felt like a true denizen of Paris for the very first time. People stopped to look, but they weren't seeing me. They were running their eyes along the lines of my mermaids. And then the faces became familiar. The orphan, the evangelist, the toy maker, and the rest, one by one, they came because of the members of the book club at school. Strangers came too. Naomi, Zinnia's assistant, beckoned them all in, offering champagne. The regulars of Cafe Cappuccino left their tables and wandered in, carrying their own cocktails. All the ballerinas from the little opera down the street joined the crowd after their show, their hair still riddled with pins, their faces glistening with cold cream. Of course, it was Hayes I was waiting for. When he finally showed up, my first instinct was to apologize for keeping Zinnia all day, but as he walked up to me, he smiled wide, took my hand, kissed my cheek. Come on, he said. She's pretty as a picture. And he met the mermaids in the windows. He advanced into the crowd that had gathered to find Zinnia. People moved about the bookcases, up and down the stairs, walked along the gallery overhead. They took books from the shelves, paged through them, and either put them back or held them in their arms. The sight of customers browsing made the shop seem even more fragile than before. I sat behind my desk to do business. I sold so many books, I worried I charged too little. When one person left, two would arrive, and the party went on. Zinnia insisted I give a speech. She sent me up the staircase to sneak in and around the people that gathered on the steps. I stopped midway. Hayes whistled sharp. Everyone quieted. I don't know what to say, I said into the silence, to laughter, to applause. Tell us your name, Zinnia called out to me. Oh, yes, I said. It was then I realized, despite having had dreams of being an actor when I was a child, that I'd never in my life announced myself to such a large gathering of people. Lend me your ears. Tell us your story, Zinnia prompted. My story, I said. My story was that I didn't dare tell them what my story was. I didn't dare tell them because it was too fanciful and grim. I had become a bookseller only to discover that I was a book collector, a hoarder of books. No matter what book they wanted to buy, and no matter what price they wanted to pay, I didn't want them to have it. It was every eccentric shopkeep and every children's book ever written. It was the doctor of a doll hospital, with drawers full of glass eyes and horsehair wigs. La Librairie Sarin, I wanted to say, was only sea mist and delirium. A few White Star executives happened along, leading a tour of 5 or 6 men, and they all looked at me as they passed, none of them saying hello. One executive stayed behind while the others moved along, and he demanded to know, rather impolitely, who I was and what I was doing, and why I dragged my legs so. So when I was denied entry to the ship a few days later, and told that someone else had been assigned to my library, I thought it might have been my limp and my cane that did me in. That's not what they said. What they said was that bringing in my own books was a kind of insubordination. But what I believed, and what I still believe, is that it was decided that I was not up to the exacting standards of such a grand ship, not even in second class. Whatever the reason, I did not board the Titanic. The room seemed impossibly quiet, and I did not die. I'll just stop there. And, I'm happy to answer any questions or anything you'd like to know about, as long as
One of the things I like in this story is how the works of classic literature that are mentioned kind of weave through the story of the three main characters. And I was curious how much the choice of those books affected their story and how much their story affected the choice of the books you used.
So I need to repeat the question for the video, but
Sorry.
so the question is about how the books that are part of the book club influenced the characters, and how much the characters influenced the books that were selected. You mean in terms of my writing?
Yeah, during your writing process.
Oh boy. This is a hard book to write in that sense. And so, I mean, any historical novel, I always dive full force into the research, and I feel like I can't have the character move an inch until I know what their shoes were made of. You know, so it's so I over research, and then I get scolded by the editors, like, you don't need all of this, you don't need to know what his shoes are made of. And then, so I cut it out, or I leave it in, or usually cut it out, but then find some other way to sneak it in or to it. But the idea is that all the details, I mean, I need for them, to me, each line is integral to the book. Every detail communicates something about the characters, something about the world that they live in. But ultimately, that doesn't make the book highly skimmable. You know, it doesn't. It's a book that I hope invites a kind of lingering. You know, so I do some research at the very beginning to get a sense of, because the world that I'm researching does ultimately influence the characters in their lives and the decisions that they make. And so, and it might be something as small as just what they eat, or how they drink, or how they get from one place to the next. And so ultimately, I do some research at the beginning, but I don't really know what I need to know until I start the characters moving. And so then I'm figuring out those details. And so I guess it's kind of a mix, ultimately, that I had no idea what the books were going to be. And I even asked my editor, I should back up and explain that the book club is not my idea. So I proposed a different book that also, that was actually, okay, so sometimes you write the whole book and then your agent sells it to an editor and then you revise it with the editor. But in a couple of instances, I've written proposals for ideas and have had some sample chapters. And that was the case with this. So I came up with this idea that I pitched to my editor, and there was a bookshop in it, but ultimately it ended up in 1920s Hollywood and the making of a silent film production of the Titanic. And so then my editor took that proposal and she discussed it with people at Doubleday, and then she called me up and she's like, "Oh, you know, we were thinking, what about a book called The Titanic Book Club?" I'm like, okay. And so in their discussion of it, the book had kind of morphed into being set entirely in this Paris bookshop, which was only going to be the first part of the book. And so the first part of the book that I proposed ended up being the whole book, and then this book club concept emerged from it. And so I said, sure, I'll write that book. It's because it seems like sometimes it's easier if they just tell you what to write, right? Than trying to figure out what they want and what they're going to care about. So I said, well, that's interesting. And I thought this would give me an opportunity to really write about somebody in love with books, from top to bottom, not just the stories they tell, not just their characters, but the structure of the book, the design of it, the industry that goes into the object itself. And so So I knew that was what would be at the heart of York, the narrator. So I asked my editor, I'm like, well, okay, so how do I make this book club thing work? And I said, I'm just going to make the books up. Readers want to see real books. So then she suggested some books that have book clubs in them. And so I read those, and those weren't helpful. But so I don't remember at what point I decided, well, maybe it'll be interesting if they're books that are forbidden in some sense. Like I think that's where the case where the characters were influencing the concept of the books that they read. And so I started doing some research and figuring out which books had been challenged or banned, and in some instances I knew there were some books I wanted that I thought, well, maybe they were banned at some point, but I couldn't find any real evidence. But ultimately, they do mention The Turn of the Screw, which it seems like that, but surely somebody banned it somewhere, right? I could only find like just the slightest little bit of evidence of that. And even The Awakening, there was like maybe one preacher in the Midwest or something. So, but that concept of books that were challenged at least helped me kind of whittle it down and come up with books, and then from that list, I was able to. That's kind of when the characters then influenced which books I selected, and so. But that involved reading all those books and figuring out what they meant to the story. And the funny thing is like so. This novel is largely about fate and survival and loss and grief and fear and anxiety and also like hope and a sense of feeling, blessed and pursuing your dreams, and so all of that stuff. And so I wanted these characters to respond to those emotions, desires, concepts, and so I wanted the books that would provoke that. Well, pretty much every book, you can find evidence of that. All the great books certainly have those kinds of reflections here and there. And so ultimately then, in thinking about how the characters would think about the books, that also then shaped the discussions that they would have. Because the other question is like, well, what if the reader hasn't read the book? Isn't it? Then it's going to be kind of dull, reading about characters talking about a book they haven't read. So then that was something I wanted to avoid too, so that they could kind of discuss things you didn't really have to have read the book to know, and then carry off on their own peculiar obsessions and particular concerns. It's a very long-winded response to your question, but it was a process.
Is there a bookshop that you base this on? Because you describe it in great detail as if you have seen it with your own eyes.
So the question is whether the bookstore is based on a bookshop that I know. And not specifically, no. And so, but I certainly lifted bits and pieces of bookstores I've been to. But probably one of my very favorite bookstores is in Omaha, in the Old Market, Jackson Street Booksellers. And it's much like this. It doesn't have an upper level like in this book, but there is just the stacks of books and just this kind of, you can turn a corner and just knock over some rarity that that you can't live without or something. And so I always walk out. It's hard to go in there because I know I'm going to spend a lot of money carrying books under my arms. But and it's just a constant discovery. I think you could go in there every day and just discover something new that you haven't seen before. So and I actually approximated that shop in a previous book too. Rebecca mentioned Devils in a Sugar Shop, which is my third novel, which has a bookshop called Mermaid Singing. So a mermaid thing. So yeah, but really it did just once part of the fun I think of creating physical spaces is just decorating it, and figuring out what in that time period and under particular resources that York would have, what might actually be in that shop, but also just kind of indulging Rigsy too in terms of how he divides the shop up, and his idiosyncratic approach to book selling. So some of that just kind of, and that was the case too, where it's like I came up with a bookshop, and then York also influenced that bookshop description, and the bookshop influenced York's characterization. So, yeah. But I did love that idea once my editor brought it up to me, the idea that the novel really should be housed in that shop. The entire book should be set mostly in the shop, and it is to a large degree, but it's not entirely. They wander around a bit, but and that was so. Then also kind of like when I wrote The Perfume Thief, because that was during World War II when Paris was under siege. I kind of needed to keep everybody, all the buildings close together, and so I kind of molded a Paris to my particular needs. Whereas this time, they're really in Paris, and so you could take a walking trip of this. I plotted out how long it would take to get from one place to the next, and how they would get there, and I had this Baedeker's, the Baedeker's guides. So I had one of those to Paris in 1910, I think it was, and it has a little onion skin map that you delicately unfold because its creases are crumbling, trying to hold it together. But and so with that, I was able to kind of figure out the subway, and how long it might take them to walk from one place to the next.
When you start your writings, do you have in your mind, or can you visualize the characters and how are they going to act with each other? Or does that evolve as you write?
So the question is, can I imagine the characters and how they act toward each other, or does that evolve as I write? I think it's a mix of both. I mean, I have to, so the process of this book, for so long, it took me an inordinate amount of time to figure out where it should start. And so I started in the wrong place, and wrote for a while in the wrong direction, and then realized, look, it needs to start with the book club, right? so then that was the obvious answer that I kind of just overlooked, and so the chapters that I was writing were just about York, and so it kind of started with his childhood and then how he ended up in Paris, and so we didn't even get to the characters, the main characters of the book club or any of that, and so. But the scene then, once I figured that out, the scene that I wrote with the first meeting of the book club is pretty much the way it came out. Like that didn't get revised much, and each character had it. I felt like they needed, since there was kind of a large cast of characters, each one needed some distinction, something that we would kind of know them on sight, or they had a nickname or something. So a lot came together in that first chapter when they first all gathered, and then, but then things did change, and as it went along, and also just because I didn't know. I also didn't when you're writing about love and love affairs and affection and that sort of thing, you're thinking like, well, how long does that take? I mean, how long does it take for people to fall in love? And so so at one point I watched that movie Jules and Jim, the Truffaut movie, which is also kind of about a triangle, it's a very efficient film. Like it moves us, we engage with the characters, we get involved in their relationships, and so I wrote down each scene, like what happens in each scene. And so I watch it, pause it, right? Thinking that would teach me something. Well, I think just doing that helped me. I never returned to that. I never actually consulted and figured out, oh, so I need 3 scenes for them to, but it did ultimately kind of subconsciously speak to my sense of the pacing of things. Now some would say that the pacing is still pretty slow, but it's like because like my editor, for example. But but so yeah, so I was writing it and again in kind of a weird way. So I started with nothing and then was writing towards a deadline, and so my editor was reading it as I was writing it, as opposed to me writing a whole draft of her reading it. So that was unusual. And so she was sending me back notes, and we got the first 100 pages strong enough that she could kind of put it into production, so the cover could be designed, and they could get it on the sales list, and they could start the thing you need to do in order to get the book out on time. And so I had the cover before I turned in the final version. So then I started working the cover into the narrative a little bit. And there's even like one of the prizes you could take home is a book plate. That's actually in the book too. That's derived from the cover. So yeah, so it was. The process was probably more demanding than other books I've written in terms of the research because I had so many things I was trying to juggle. But at the same time, like incredibly rewarding. Like it was just, in the writing process, I feel like I really need to like linger over everything I'm writing. I feel like I'll write for an hour and I have to lie down for the rest of the day. So it's easy to indulge that sense of like,